Image description. A slide reads Tactile Language Development with Kaycee Bennett. Below are the logos for the Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project, the National Intervener and Advocate Association, and Wisconsin RID.
My name is Heidi Hollenberger, and I'm an education consultant with the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Outreach Program. I also support the Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project. This training series, Empowering Interveners, is a collaboration between the Wisconsin RID, the National Intervener Advocacy Association, and the Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project. And this month we have Kaycee Bennett again. If you joined us last month, you will recognize her. Kaycee is going to talk about the topic tactile language. If you're interested in RID CEUs and or a certificate of participation, Jen will drop that into the chat for you to access. You don't have to fill it out today, but if you can fill it out by the end of the week, that would be great. And then at the end of the presentation, we will have a post survey that will also be dropped into the chat. That helps us report to our grant. So WDBTAP is the Deafblind grant. And so we report to the Office for Special Ed Programs on our activities. And so your post surveys help us to be able to do that reporting. So I'm gonna go ahead because I'm sure Kaycee has lots to cover. Thank you for coming, Kaycee, and thank you for all of the participants for being here today.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen, and we are going to be using the chat today, and it doesn't look like it's enabled. So if somebody can enable that so that people are able to use that chat, that would be awesome. Okay. There we go. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I am Kaycee Bennett, and we're going to talk about tactile language development today. I am a deafblind education consultant, and I come from the world of deaf education. That is my background. I taught deaf education in a self-contained setting and then an itinerant setting. And then I specialized in deafblind education and was a teacher for students who are deafblind in an itinerant setting. And then became a consultant, and I've been doing that for about 6.5 years now, and absolutely love it. And I'll share a little bit about myself personally as well. We are going to get to know each other today through the chat. I really want this to be a discussion, and I know that is a little tricky in a webinar format with this many people, but I think we can do it, and I hope that you'll participate as we go. There's 3 pictures on the screen. Picture on the far left is of my family. It's me, my husband, and our son Carson. He is 5 and very, very active. And in addition to my work in deafblind education, Carson has led me to do a lot of advocacy work in food allergy and eosinophilic disorders. So sorry, Keith, the interpreter. Eosinophilic, EOSINOPHILIC, which is a white blood cell disorder of the esophagus that my son has. And so that keeps me busy when I'm not working. This center photo is a picture of my husband and I hiking in Wyoming, beautiful Wyoming, that we went last year. Our family loves to be outside and do everything outdoors, and that was a wonderful trip that we had to Yellowstone. And then on the right are my puppies. Those are my greyhounds. They are retired. They were racers, and this last week has been very crazy. They are seniors. They're 10 and 12, and they went on a middle of the night adventure. They broke out of our gate and got out, which has never happened. And it was very scary. Ari, unfortunately, was hit by a car, but she is doing very well. She's home and recovering. It has been a very crazy week. She's doing well. And yes, it's been busy, busy, busy. But that's a little bit about me personally. We love our baby. And then today, here's some of the fun that we are going to be talking about today. This is a book. There's a picture on the screen of the front of a book, cover of a book. I have that here in front of me as well. It's called If You Can See It, You Can Support It, a book on tactile language. This is a book that was published by the Nordic Welfare Center in the Nordic countries. And they are so generous with their work over there. It's really quite amazing. They put out wonderful things. And we, in the entirety of deafblind education, have been learning from our friends in the Nordic countries. And they have put out this publication that I personally believe is the most practice-changing piece of writing that I have ever read. I've watched it change my own practice, as well as the practice of so many practitioners that we've coached through a book study on this. I love it so much. And one of the best things about it is that it's free. I have on the screen a QR code so that you can download it. Again, it's called If You Can See It, You Can Support It, a book on tactile language. Leave this QR code up for a minute. You can scan it. You can download it free as a PDF, which you're free to, read on your device, or you can print it out. Back in the day, they used to actually mail these to the United States for free. But so many, we told everybody we know about this book. And so they were shipping many to the US and have stopped that for now. But you can still download it for free. And I highly encourage you to. We are going to spend the time together today pretty entirely just looking at quotes and snippets from this book and discussing them. Does anybody need more time? Just put more in the chat. If you need it back up, I will come back to it. Okay. Perfect. We're going to jump in and talk about this circle model that's on the screen in just a second, but I do want to say, since we're using the chat function, and I know it can take some time to type out what you want to say, especially when we're talking about, reactions to quotes and things like that. I don't want you to feel like, oh, the moment's passed. I don't want to send this anymore. I'll delete it. Never mind. We can always go back. If I've moved on to a different slide and you're still typing, keep typing. I want to see them. I want us to discuss them. Also, a lot of the quotes connect to each other because the overarching topic today is tactile language development, right? So they connect throughout. Please send it if you have something to say, even if it takes you a while to get that sent into the chat. We're going to start with this one. This is going to take us the most amount of time here. This model, they call the circle model, Tactile Language Circle Model. And it is chapter 2 of this book. Has this image and has descriptions over each of these pieces, okay? So there's a lot of things on this screen. It is a red circle that says tactile language in the middle. And then there are branches off of it of different components of tactile language. And we're gonna go through those together. I'm gonna start at the top, like 12 o'clock off this circle. And we're going to talk about both tactile exploration and tactile categorization. Okay, so in this, it's talking about really how much more time consuming it is and just mentally demanding it is to explore and understand the world through touch than it is through sight. Most of us explore the world through sight, and we get information just instantly, so much information about what's going on around us. We're able to explore and categorize information just instantaneously. And for those who are exploring through their sense of touch, it just takes more time and energy. It's totally doable. It just takes longer. And so it does take some through this part of the book, focuses on that a bit, and also focuses on what these different things can look like. So being like using the mouth and tongue for fine detail exploration, the fingertips for slightly larger detail, which could be things like braille, using the whole hand to understand size, and then categorization, looking at different things like texture, temperature, flexibility, positioning, and so on. And looking at those things in relation to language and to language development. These are all components of language, okay? And so that's how this circle model starts out. And then we'll move into linguistic categories, which is the next one to the right. Linguistic categories is broken into 5 subcategories, sub-pieces there. The one on the top says BETS, that's bodily, emotional traces. And if you're not familiar with the term bodily emotional traces, it's when there's an emotional event that leaves an imprint sensorily, an imprint on the individual's body. We may see this at a later time. So, for example, if something emotional happened to the individual who is congenitally deafblind and they react in a way where they pull their head down and pull their arms up over their head in that situation to like protect themselves. At another time when they feel afraid, their body may automatically do that. It remembers that imprint of fear is this feeling, it's this motion. And so it's not something that they're like deciding, oh, I'm scared, and one time I was scared and I did that, so I'm going to do this. It's not something they're thinking about and deciding to do. It's something their body's doing on its own. Okay, so that's bodily emotional traces, and that's that top one. And you may note it's under linguistic categories. So those bets, bodily emotional traces that we may see from a child when they make that motion and we say, oh, they're afraid, that is language. That is tactile bodily language. Now, it does have very low readability, meaning people who are not super familiar with that individual may have no idea that that means that they're scared. It may take a lot of work to figure out what that means, and we'll talk about low readability kind of throughout today, because that is a real challenge with some of this tactile language or tactile bodily language that we're talking about today. The next one is HTP signs, which is hypertactile perceptions. Very similar to BETS, except for it doesn't have to have that emotional component to it. So an example of that one would be if every time an individual who's congenitally deafblind gets a glass of water, they put their dominant hand into the glass of water in kind of a bent 5 shape to check and see how much water is in the cup. And so to them, this just flat 5 shape all by itself may mean I'm thirsty, I need water, want water. Can be something that they do decide, doesn't have to be the body's like spontaneous use of that, although it can be. Again, though, often low readability, unless you've seen that kiddo do that with a cup of water a million times, you're probably not going to instantly think water, right? When you see this bit by hand shape. So it brings some challenges, but it also is a sign that makes a lot of sense to that child's body because it's how they experience that water. And we'll talk more about that through some quotes later. May make some more sense in a little bit. The next one on the list is signs as perceived. And this one is kind of interesting. This was something I didn't think about for a long time in working with my students who were deafblind. It took me a while to kind of figure this one out. When you are receiving formal signs, like conventional signs, through a tactile modality, okay, they feel different than they look, right? So if your hands, if you're the individual who's deafblind and your hands are on a signer's hands and you are receiving the sign, you're probably not getting every single little detail, especially if you are emerging in your language development. Therefore, when you go to express those signs, they're probably not going to look exactly like the sighted person who's signing to you's signs. They're probably going to look a little different. They're going to look like how they perceive them. So when a student who is congenitally deafblind starts signing something and everybody's going, hey, what does this mean? And you're like, I have no idea. It's a really great time to sit back and think, what could feel like that, right? And like try to replicate that and think, what do we sign to them that could feel anyhow in this area? And you might find that they may be signing, trying to sign more formal sign than you may have previously thought. Conventional signs is an easy one. That's signs as they're typically presented, signs as we typically use them in formal language. Mimetic expression means like mime, mimetic being like mime, so like acting it out, gesturing and acting out what you mean, what you did, what you want to talk about. All of those are under that linguistic categories section. The next one down is under tactile sign language. And tactile sign language has 5 things listed in that one as well: signing space, grammar, hand shapes, reading signs and utterances, and articulation place. These are all things that we consider in sign language. And basically in this section, it's just saying all of these things are still important and they're still components of sign language, but they're going to look different. For example, in visual sign language, a lot of the grammar, we've got facial grammar, we've got a lot going on that's not produced manually. We may know it's a question from the eyebrows, things like that, where in a tactile sign language, that's not going to work. You're going to have to make some changes to that. So those types of considerations throughout. Same thing with signing space. You're going to have to consider that individual's access needs in deciding and negotiating with that individual what that signing space needs to look like, and just considerations through that section. The next section, so now we're at the 6 o'clock at the bottom of this circle. Haptic signals, commenting and describing. So like I mentioned, this is written in the Nordic countries. We do use some haptics here in certain states more than others. This is really talking about those methods of being able to share information in real time, to comment on things to describe placement, to describe people, to describe what's going on during ongoing conversation. So you don't have to stop telling a story to add in like, you know, an affirmative. I'm with you, I'm following you, I agree. Which as sighted people, we can gather from people making eye contact and nodding along. For our individuals who are deafblind, if they're using haptic signals, we can give that information tactily. Sometimes that's on the back, on the shoulder, on the leg, depends on the individual and their preferences. We can give information, like commenting information like that, or describing information like if the individual is the one sharing, we can tell them if people are paying attention to them. We can tell them if we're still standing there listening through haptics. So haptics is another piece of tactile language. Next to the left is multi-party conversation. Multi-party conversation is another one that I think we don't think about that often. How do our students know that more than one person can talk at the same time or have a group discussion about something? Have they been in contact with more than one person at a time for a conversation? It doesn't have to be a formal language conversation, but just a conversation. Do they know other people talk to each other? Have they ever, quote unquote, eavesdropped? Hearing and sighted children do this from birth, right? They hear conversations going on all around them. They learn so much about language incidentally through eavesdropping, through overhearing, through observing. And we don't always remember to give our students who are deafblind that same opportunity. So multi-conversation is a big one. And I think we also might think about this for our students who are really proficient communicators and have a lot of formal language. Sometimes we don't think about it for our students who are more emerging language users, or who are using language with lower readability, like a tactile bodily language. But it's just as important for them too. We just have to get creative about what that can look like. If anybody has any questions or thoughts or stories or anything, feel free to put them in. I will not be defining for you this whole lesson, this whole session today, I promise. I just want to get some of this terminology out of the way, and then we'll move through to the more fun stuff in the quotes. The next one is tactile positioning. Tactile positioning is kind of interesting. We should position ourselves in a way that we're tactile bodily accessible to that student, because language does not just come from our hands, right? I have never met an individual who's congenitally deafblind who only communicates with their hands, right? It's the whole body. So we need to be in a position where we can read the information coming off from their body, and that they have access to ours for us to communicate to them. That's how we can have a conversation back and forth. It's super important that the conversation partner can recognize and confirm and include the bodily expressions in the conversation. That last sentence is a quote from this section. And this can look a lot of different ways, and it totally depends on the student and their needs, not only access needs, but also physical positioning needs. So they may prefer to lie or sit or stand face to face, lie, sit, or stand side by side, or that the person who is deafblind may sit with their back to the conversation partner's front for physical support, to help hold them up if they have lower tone issues. And that can pose some challenges, in that if the communication partner is sighted and is trying to read, cues off the student's face, they may not have access to that anymore if the individual who's deafblind is sitting in front of them. So in that case, you can use mirrors. You can use like an iPad setup, so you have like real-time video, so you can watch it and see their response to your movement, to your communication. Sometimes we have to get very creative, but those positions can totally change based on whether you're working on something really familiar or novel, whether it's an activity that requires more movement or what have you. It can differ throughout the entire day, and certainly differ for each kiddo. And then we've got bodily, tactile, emotional involvement. And for this one, I'm going to read a quote from this one too. It's vitally important in communication that the conversation partner is emotionally present, mirroring, and confirming the person with congenital deafblindness in her emotional expressions through the bodily tactile modality. Which that quote reminds me, if you hear bodily tactile, or you hear me say tactile bodily, they're interchangeable. They're the same thing. Just in the States, we tend to say tactile bodily more. I don't know why. Okay, so that being said, we have to be present, right? We have to be present. We have to share our emotions with the student we're working with or individual we're working with, but also mirror their emotions and show them that we are there, that we feel those emotions, that we're in that moment with them. That is how they, can feel supported and feel that we care and that we're there for them, just like any other human, right? We want to feel that other people acknowledge and appreciate our emotions. Excuse me. Okay, and then the last one for the circle model is activity and conversation space. This one, the content is not tricky, but it's different wording than we tend to use here in the States. So an activity space, when they're talking about activity space, is talking about the actual activity, so the activity itself, what they're doing. And then the conversation space is the conversation about that activity. So they're using the word space differently than we typically do here. So they're really just talking about the activity that's happening and the conversation about the activity, and how those pieces are so key in building this tactile language, that the language that our students are using from their body, their tactile bodily language, if you will, is coming from their real life experiences, their activities, and the way that we reflect on those activities with them. A lot of times people think about reflection with formal language, and it certainly can be, right? We tell our friends what happened. We share with our family about, the good things and the bad things that have gone on through formal language. Our students also tell us about the good things and the bad things that have happened. It may not be through formal language, but it's still happening. And it can be very tricky with that low readability that is talked about throughout this book. But it can be done. Just takes a lot of detective work. We have to try and figure out, what are they saying? How are they saying it? Why does it look like that? What have they done in the past that their body moved that way? So much work, and we'll talk about a lot of that through the quotes today. Okay, circle model, so much information. But again, you can review that and read in lots more detail about the circle model in chapter 2 of this book that you just downloaded. But wanted you to have some of that vocabulary. I know for me, when I read this the first time, I probably read this book, I don't know, 20 times maybe, but when I read this the first time, I was a little overwhelmed at first, but then felt very, let's what's the word I want to use? Like affirmed, like, oh, I do that, but I didn't know it had a name. Or I've seen my students do that. I didn't know that was like a real thing. And so I hope maybe some of you feel that way too, and feel like, hey, we're on the right track. This is language that we're helping with here, that we're supporting, that we're developing in our students. It has a name, and our friends in the Nordic country just defined it for us. So we've got this circle model to lean on, and they have been so gracious with it, allowed us to reprint it even in Texas, to be able to share it with more people. So you have that. Okay, here's the fun part. We're going to move into some quotes. This is the longest one. I know it's a lot on the screen. I'm going to read it to you. This one is by Goran, Goran. And he says this on page 84 of the publication. He is actually the director now of the Nordic Welfare Center. Super nice guy. And I'm going to move my little Zoom thing so I can read this book to you. Okay. He says, persons with congenital deafblindness have limited access to conventional sign language as a first language unless they have sufficient functional residual vision. This creates problems with access. Accessing visual sign language may prove difficult. When looking at the expressions made by the person with congenital deafblindness themselves, we can see that the expressions most often are not based on the visual sign language. Rather, the linguistic expressions arise from what they are sensing through the bodily and tactile modality. That's a lot of words. That makes total sense. So what he is saying is, for example, in visual sign language and visual ASL, if we think about the sign for tree, okay, we think about the sign for tree, we've got our arm up at like a 90-degree angle, we've got our open 5, we've got it moving, showing the shaking leaf, rattling leaves, we've got branches. Now, if we think about a deaf child with typical vision, developing language, they see a tree in real life with a trunk, with branches, with leaves that blow in the wind. They see trees in books. They see the sign for tree. Yeah, right? That makes sense. The sign totally matches the concept that they have for tree. Looks like a tree, moves like a tree. It is tree-like, okay? If we think about a student who is congenitally deafblind, and this book does, I should have started with that. This book does focus primarily on congenitally deafblind children who are born deafblind, with varying levels of residual hearing and vision, but born deafblind. So if we think about a student who's congenitally deafblind and their real life experience with a tree, okay, think about that a second. You've got a student who's congenitally deafblind. What is tree to them? Put it in the chat. What do you think? What's the first thing you think of? Yeah, rough, bark, hard, rough bark, rough, pokey. Yeah, it could be big, maybe so. Okay, yeah. My first thought was could be smooth branches. Yeah, if they were lifted up to the branches, or if the tree is really short, right? Depends. My first thought was bark, rough bark, like many of you posted or shared in the chat. Totally depends though if they're used to exploring old established trees, right? Where everything they feel when they reach is bark. or if they have little baby trees where they feel kind of pokey and leafy, and they may be really breakable, really fragile because they're small and growing. It depends on what area they're in, what their experiences have been. For me, where I live is a lot of big established oak trees. And so the first thing I thought of is feeling that bark, right? Or you can kind of get your fingers in between it. Kind of feels weird. Sometimes it'll break off. Sometimes it's really stuck on there. That may be tree for our students who are congenitally deafblind. That might be their experience with trees. They may have also experienced a small tree where they could feel the leaves and things, but they probably are not making a connection between those two things because they're so tactily different. Okay, now if they're exploring this bark, this is tree, their brain and body is like, yep, this is tree, I know what this is, I feel this every day when I get off the bus, this is my front yard, this is a tree. And someone presents the ASL sign for tree to them tactily. It is going to be very tricky for them to make that connection between the way their body feels on the tree, with the tree, and that visual sign. Not to say that they cannot learn that. Of course they can. We have plenty of students who have learned it. But it's not going to come super naturally. What's going to come much more naturally is whatever sign their body produces. So that may be like this little claw shape I've got going here to show where their fingers fit in the bark. That may be tree to them. Now, going to be super readable? No. We're going to have to watch them explore trees and see that that's how they have their hands shaped to then know that they're talking about a tree when they bring it up at some point. It's tricky. Video is a really great tool to help with that. And once somebody has figured out that it's tree, noting that, documenting that can be really, really helpful. But that's what Goran is getting at here, is it's going to be really hard to have a conventional sign language as a first language without a bunch of functional vision. Okay, if they're exploring the world tactily, their first language is probably going to be a tactile bodily language. Okay, perfect. We have a question. How would you explain that to a learner who the education system and the parent want the learner to be heavily dependent on their iPad communication device and not signs with tactile and limited hand mobility? That's a really good question. And I think it is really, really tricky because of the boom in technology. I think, you know, we see technology doing all these wonderful things, high-tech devices now and all of these things. And I think it can be really easy for teachers and for families to seem like that, you know, would be such a nice solution for them to have that. And I think not dismissing that and not dismissing that want for you know, free communication with the public, which I think is typically what draws people to iPad communication devices, is wanting them to be able to communicate with people that are less familiar with them. And that's, of course, something we all want, right? I think not dismissing it, but instead stressing that we have to have a first language first, that we have to have an established language that makes sense in order to learn a new language, in order to learn a foreign language, a language that may not be fully accessible for that child. And it's not easy. It's not an easy, quick thing to do. But I think too, when you can when you can show some success in that and show, you know, the student is making choices. The student is telling us what they want to eat. The student is expressing their emotions, expressing their wants and needs through this tactile bodily modality, and we are watching so closely that we are solving this mystery. We know what they're saying now, and we're able to teach those around them. Hey, they want to go play at the tree. Hey, they want water, with these really unconventional, internally created signs coming from the deaf ed world. You know, in my studies, it was always really negatively talked about, quote unquote, home sign, right? So using signs that are not conventional was always really, we have to get rid of that home sign. It was always just a very negatively viewed thing. I came into the field with that perception coming from my studies. And it took me a while to realize we're not going to get to conventional without this bridge of signs that make sense to that student. We have to start there. Not that that's the only thing they can ever learn. We can absolutely build on that and transition to it. And somebody just asked, how do you transition to it? Once you have a really solid foundation, you can start pairing. Just like we do when we transition through any other hierarchy, right? We've got a student using object symbols, and then we use partial objects, and then, you know, we move through this hierarchy and pair them until they understand, and then pair them with the next thing and pair them with the next thing. We can do that with dynamic language as well. We can use that with sign language too. If they're signing tree, you can affirm that and say, like, yes, I understand this tree. You can go to the tree and touch it, and you sign it that way, and they sign it that way, and then you can sign the formal sign for tree. You pair it. We don't want to just dismiss, I don't know what they're saying, or that's how they sign tree. They just won't sign it right and not acknowledge and affirm that tree to them is that internal, that's their sign for it. Great question. Thank you guys for asking them. Feel free to keep them coming. I'll move to the next one, but feel free to keep them coming if you're still typing. Okay, this is a fabulous one. This is from Kari Schjoll Brede on page 33. Also, in case you're wondering, they're not in book order. These are just random quotes that I love from this book. This one says, first we have to believe that they can and will tell their stories, and then try to understand how and what they sense, the language of this person, and how it expresses her thoughts. I really love this one because I feel like at the heart of this is presuming competence. We all want that, right? We want that for all of our students. We want everyone to presume competence for our students. Every single individual can and will tell their story. We, the communication partners, may have to work really hard to understand those stories, but we have to believe that they're happening, that that's happening, or we will never understand them. This has to come first. We have to, at the heart of all things, believe that they are already telling us their stories, and that it's our job to figure out what that story is and how they're telling us. If anybody has comments or anything, throw them in the chat. Okay, this is a fun one too. So this is in reference to the question, when is it language? So I think a lot of people would look at some of the things we're talking about today and say that is not language. And this is in reference to that question. And Nedelina Ivanova, her name is on the screen, she said this on page 34. And before I read it, there's a lot of power in this quote, but I think one of the most powerful things about it is that Nedelina is a linguist. A linguist said this about tactile language. Nothing is a linguistic sign unless it is interpreted as one. Read it again. Nothing is a linguistic sign unless it is interpreted as one. I feel like it's really powerful. What do you guys think? I really like that it throws it back to us, the communication partners. It's language if we understand it. It's our job to understand it. If we can understand what they're saying, what they're sharing, that's language. And that's not just like our opinion. This is a linguist, a person who studies language for a living. She's a sign language analyst. I love it. I feel like there's so much power in this. This isn't just like, just the crazy deafblind education lady saying like, we have to do this. This is our job. This researcher has shared this, and I think there's a lot of power in that. I love everything that she writes in this book, honestly, but this is a big one for me. Okay, Heather shared in the chat, I don't know any deafblind students, but I have had lots of experience with language delayed or deprived deaf friends, and this quote applies to them too. We have to believe that they can communicate and will communicate. Absolutely, absolutely. Could not agree more. And we're going to talk more about some more things today that I feel like also apply to those friends. Unfortunately, we do still see so much language deprivation for our students who are deaf, and especially for our students who are deaf who have disabilities. And it's yes, 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 yes. Oh, that leads me right into this one, which is which is a big one that connects to what you just said. This is from a 1989 Gallaudet study that is in this, that's mentioned in this book. You can find it on page 43. And so that's what, 35 years ago? Math, not my strong suit, but I think that's right. 36 years ago? I don't know. And when we think about how long ago that was and how relevant this still is today, it's a little disheartening, but I'm going to read the quote. It appears to us to be unrealistic to think that a person who does not know a language and who cannot receive it in the form presented could learn much from someone trying to communicate in that language. I think most people's first reaction to that quote is probably, duh, right? Like, of course, if you don't know a language and you don't have access to the language, you're not going to learn much from somebody talking to you in that language. And that is common sense. That is a common sense statement from 30 some odd years ago, 36 years. Thank you so much, Justin. And that, unfortunately, is still what we see all the time, right? All the time we see this. We see students who are deafblind who we come in and ask about their communication, and they say, oh well, we talked to him and he did a deaf ed class and we signed, and he's just not learning language. He must have a cognitive impairment that's preventing him from learning language. Or we have this deaf student who we're talking to all day and they haven't learned it yet. They must have a cognitive impairment, and they get put into classrooms where their language is not supported. I would love to tell you this was a thing from 30 years ago and that we have fixed it and it is all better. But we know that's not the case. We're still seeing this all the time. And we have to bring this back up for every single one of our students and say, are you communicating in their language that they understand? That may not be a formal language. Excuse me. That may not be a formal language. That may be a tactile bodily language. If we're not communicating in a way that they can receive it, they are not going to learn from us. And that is not a them problem. That is an us problem. Okay, if somebody walked up to me and just started speaking German, I know no German. I would just stand there and stare in panic. Okay, I would have no idea how to respond. I would not be able to understand anything that's being said to me. I wouldn't be able to receive it in the form that it's presented. I would learn nothing from them. And because I'm hearing and sighted, they would probably just say, oh, she just doesn't know German. She might be a real smart lady, she just doesn't know German. But unfortunately, for our students who are deaf or deafblind, it's oftentimes assumed that there are cognitive disabilities, which is so crazy. And it's going to take every single one of us advocating all the time that our students have accessible language that makes sense to them in order for more formal language to develop. Has to happen, has to. Okay, we had a comment come in. I had a student from Central America who grew up with gestures. At age 10, they were able to learn multiplication and write sentences in a year. To see the student pick up language with the resources provided was amazing. I love that so much. And I would assume that the people who are working with them gestured first, right? Met them where they were in a language that made sense to them, and then built on it. Added that formal conventional language, added on to those gestures, to those pictures, to those things that the student was familiar with, and had that first language, even though it wasn't formal, that base of information, and built on it. We can't just come in with our random abstract language that doesn't make any sense to them without first laying that foundation. Thanks so much for sharing that. Okay, the next one's kind of on the same note, but this is from someone named Arfinn. I'm probably butchering most of these names, but on page 46, they say, it is through the tactile sense that the child with congenital deafblindness can most easily, quote, unlock his or her curriculum, end quote. That's basically what we're talking about, right? In order to open up the rest of the world and learn all kinds of other information, we have to have that solid tactile foundation first for our students who are congenitally deafblind. They have to be able to express themselves in a way that makes sense to them and be able to communicate in a way that makes sense to them in order to build on it and open up the rest of the world. Okay, this one is from Caroline Lindstrom. She's a friend of mine. She wrote this section and on page 54. And small plug, she's coming to Texas to be the keynote for Texas Symposium on Deafblind Education, which is happening at the end of February and into March. And if you can get to Texas, it's going to be fabulous. We'd love to have you there. You can meet Caroline. All right, Caroline says, today, there is also research that shows that the brain has the ability to reorganize and develop areas. This means that the tactile area in the brain takes over when vision and hearing do not work fully. It is therefore legitimate to assume that people with congenital deafblindness have a greater ability to perceive and interpret information from the tactile sense than sighted hearing persons have. Well, I see some comments coming in that people are coming to the symposium. I can't wait to meet you. Okay, love this quote from Caroline. We know that the brain is so flexible, right? And does amazing things and rewires and reworks. I think what's so powerful about this quote is the last part. Assuming that our students have much more advanced tactile skills than we could ever even imagine. They're way more advanced than we are. Assuming you in the audience are sighted and hearing, sighted and or hearing. The congenitally deafblind children that we're working with are way more advanced than we are in the tactile sense. I think there's a lot of power in that. I think it's overlooked all the time. Thinking about this, the strength in tactile skills, tactile identification, tactile discrimination, tactile, all kinds of tactile skills. Thinking about the strength that they have and how it's very likely way more advanced than we can even really wrap our minds around. It can really open up the way that we program for our students, you know, that we plan, that we create lessons, create materials for. They're probably using their tactile sense very differently than we do, but they're probably using it way more effectively and way more often. Okay, this is kind of a fun one. As I have said a bajillion times since we started, from the deaf ed world. So this section of the book that's talking about hearing, and it mentions the McGurk effect. The video I typically play is down off YouTube for some reason. So we're gonna watch this other one, but it's good too. The little shorts off YouTube. Watch this real quick.
Watch carefully. What am I saying? Fa, fa, fa. Fa, fa, fa.
It sounds like I'm saying thaw, but here's what my mouth is really doing.
Ga, ga, ga.
Gaw, with a
Ga,
G.
ga,
Except I took
ga.
that audio away and replaced it with the sound of myself saying faw with an F.
Fa,
If you
fa,
close your eyes
fa.
or look away, you will hear the correct sound,
fa,
faw. But if you
fa.
watch, you will hear thaw.
Fa, fa, fa. Fa, fa, fa.
Because the audio and the video don't
Fa,
match, your
fa,
brain comes up with
fa.
some third thing that it believes true
Fa,
reality to be.
fa, fa.
It's called the McGurk Effect,
Fa,
and it's a wonderful
fa,
illustration of the
fa.
fact that speech isn't
Fa,
just something
fa,
we hear.
Fa, 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 fa. Fa, fa, fa. Fa. Watch carefully.
Okay, that's the McGurk effect. Has anybody heard of it before? Write me in the chat if you've heard of it before. Two. Yeah, it's not super well known. It's been around a long time. It's been researched a long time. But it is part of a section of this book called We Hear with Our Brains. Understanding speech is so much more than the ear. It's a process between the ears, the eyes, and the brain. We use our vision to support and even alter, even change the information that's coming in auditorily. If your eyes are telling you something different than what you're hearing, your brain will change it, like we just saw. If you closed your eyes or looked away, you heard the sound did not change. Like the sound was with an F. We look at it and it's a TH because of the tongue placement. Okay, our brains just said, whoop, nope, I know better than the ears. I'm going to change it. This is a really great example. This is a great tool to use, especially to explain why mild impairments can compound to create a really significant need. If we don't have full access to the vision that is doing that changing and making things make sense from what's coming in auditorily, it can make a big difference. A lot of people learned this during COVID. How many of you put me in the chat if you never realized how much you were speech reading until everybody's mouths were covered? And you were like, why can I no longer hear? I see a bunch of me's coming in. I kept hearing it over and over. Being from the hearing world, I had all these people texting me like, I think I have hearing loss. How do I know I have hearing loss? Because of these mouths, I can hear anything. People were using those visual cues and their brains are making sense of it. Never realized in the past that they struggled with actual either actual hearing loss or auditory processing or any other challenges, or just being used to relying on that visual information until it was pretty overnight gone for us, right? So this McGurk effect is a really great tool, and there's lots of videos on YouTube. I just picked a quick short one. There's one that I normally use, which I hope will be back up soon, where he says ba with a B, and then he says fa with an F, and then he says da with a D, and you hear all three different sounds, but the entire time he's just saying ba, and they're just changing the picture, and your brain just changes it each time. That's a really cool one too. So check it out. You can use that tool. There's lots of free videos on YouTube that you can use, and it's actually noted in this book. So yeah, you can check that out. From that same section, this is a quote from Rolf Jones, who is an audiologist, doctor of audiology. And they said, if we as hearing care professionals only focus our rehabilitation efforts on the ear, then we ignore a significant part of the challenge. We forget that the brain needs the best possible signals from both the ears and the eyes, and in many cases, also the tactile sense. Super love this one too. In talking about rehabilitation efforts, that can be developing oral speech. That can also be just some auditory training, learning to use functional hearing more efficiently. We have to look holistically at this kiddo. We cannot just be thinking about the ear. As some of you know from the last one, functional hearing is a big soapbox that I like to get on. We can't just look at an audiogram and then know how students are using the information coming in, how they're hearing, how they're understanding. And I think this really hits at that we have to look at the whole student, at all of their access needs, and try to give them as much input as possible And I like that this is coming from an audiologist. This isn't a deaf ed professional, or I mean a deafblind ed professional. This is somebody who traditionally is focused on the ear, is focused on hearing, right? Realizing that we need the whole picture. Speech needs the whole picture. Deaf ed needs the whole picture. We can't just be looking at the ear to brain pathway. We have to be looking at all of it. Okay, this one is also from Arfinn on page 46. And they say, a child with congenital deafblindness will have the best conditions for linguistic and communicative development if he or she is exposed to a tactily fully accessible language. Again, not really a new concept from today, right? We've got this kind of strewn throughout most of these quotes. I think the big piece here, and the piece that's often overlooked, is the fully accessible piece. We may even be providing a tactile language, maybe tactile ASL. Is that, for that student, fully accessible? Could be yes, could be no. Depends on the student, depends on their vision. Depends on their concepts, depends on their life experiences, depends on lots of things. But it's something we need to be thinking about. For some of our students who are congenitally deafblind, tactile ASL may not be fully accessible. It may rely on too many visual concepts in order to be fully accessible to the student. Things to think about. What does it look like for that student to have something tactily fully accessible as far as language goes? May take some creativity. Okay, here's another one from Nedelina. So remember, she is the linguist that wrote one of the sections in here. And she says, it is argued that the whole body is equivalent to ears in spoken languages and eyes in signed languages. Expressions from the body can be seen as equivalent to articulators in spoken and signed languages, whereas the touch, tactile, is paralleled by modality compared to using the voice in spoken or signs in signed. A lot of words, but I think it carries some powerful language in here. That we're looking at the whole body, and that the entire body is to tactile language what the voice is in spoken language, what the hands are in signed language. We're looking at the entire body. I think that's a powerful piece of this. And I think the word equivalent is a powerful piece in this. Again, we have a linguist telling us that the whole body producing language is equivalent to the voice in spoken language or the signs in sign language. I think there's a lot of power in that. Any thoughts on this one? You know, some of them are kind of wordy, and also because they're written in the Nordic countries, sometimes the language is a little different than how we typically communicate in our American English. Sometimes it takes a couple reads to be like, what now? What is she saying? go to the next slide. If anybody has thoughts they want to share, please still send them. All right, this one is from Camilla Foote. She says, I assume that one prerequisite to languaging, side note, languaging is a word that they use in this book, is that the people are together in a conversation. A conversation involves both partners directing attention toward one another, in addition to their having shared attention toward both what they're talking about, the theme, and how they are doing this, the form. Again, you may read that and think, well, yeah, of course. I think what's really big in this one, to me anyway, is that we can't have language without successful conversations. Okay, the prerequisite to languaging being like serve and return back and forth language. It's a prerequisite to that. So this has to happen. The conversation piece has to happen before language can develop. And for a conversation to happen, there has to be a communication partner who can share in this conversation, who knows how to provide that shared attention, how to talk about what the deafblind individual is talking about in their language. It sounds like a simple thing, but how often are we discounting the fact that our students may not have formal language or a ton of formal language when they have not been given this opportunity consistently? Like, think about that. There's so few opportunities presented on, throughout the day, every day, for our students to have meaningful conversations and shared attention, following all of these things that Camilla outlined here, in order to work toward language. And what we're saying here, what Camilla's saying here, is they can't do this on their own. They're not going to just develop language on their own, hanging out. We have to have these conversations involving competent communication partners in order for them to develop language. It is a prerequisite. That's what she is saying. I think this quote goes from like, duh, yeah, to like, oh man, something we really have to focus on. In the chat, it says, I think this quote confirms there's so much missed with our deafblind students getting the incidental learning that their sighted and hearing peers get without even realizing it. Yes, I think much of this book is hits on that for sure. It also says in the chat, I also feel that oftentimes the student's part in the communication is overlooked or misunderstood. Absolutely. Absolutely. Also in the chat, it says, I think we often feel like we are the teachers and the student is supposed to learn from us. But for the student to be able to learn, we first must allow the student to teach us how to communicate with them. One of my dearest friends, who was language deprived, taught me so much about how to communicate with others who are language deprived. She became my teacher. That is the most beautiful thing. That is absolutely accurate, and is so much about what this book is sharing. We have to get into the student's world or they will never join ours. We have to get into their tactile bodily world through touch, whole body touch, or they will learn nothing from us. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that so much. And then Erin said, yes, I think so many times people jump straight to symbols and language without making sure our students who are deafblind understand the basics of communication, awareness of others, topics to communicate about, and a mode. You can communicate without language. Yeah, you don't need formal language. This is language. We don't need formal language in order to communicate. Another person said, I think often attempted communication is perceived as unwanted behavior. Oh, amen to that. Yes, absolutely. It's all about our perception, right? Like Nedelina said, nothing is a sign unless it is perceived as one. It's on us. It's on the communication partners to realize that they can and will tell their story, that they are telling their stories, that we can have that back and forth communication through conversation. It doesn't have to be formal language in order for us both to understand what we're talking about, to share emotions with each other, to share on a topic. A topic can be your hand, it can be your foot, it can be a ball, it can be literally anything. The point is that we both are sharing in that. We're having some back and forth about it, taking turns. We're both touching it together. We're in the moment together. We're sharing in that. That is a prerequisite to languaging. Languaging, they define in here, basically like a serve and return communication, okay? Sharing in language back and forth. Has to happen, has to be here. And that's the communication partner. Those students are ready. They're sitting there. They're ready. They're ready to communicate and have conversations with us. We have to be able to focus that full attention and be ready for this to help them develop more language of their own and later formal language when they're ready. Okay, here's another one. How much time? Okay. The next one is from Dr. Jude Nicholas on page 110. Dr. Jude Nicholas is also the author of the Tactile Working Memory Scale. He was the lead researcher on that and lead author on that publication. I was super lucky to get to study under him in Denmark in, I don't know, 2019. I just like totally blanked on when that was. I think it was 2019. He shares on page 110, communication partners need to have highly developed skills, sensitivity, and insight in order to participate in the world of children with deafblindness, where touch and proximity are crucial. Just what we were just talking about, right? In Texas, we rely heavily on the term competent communication partner. We have it defined and have all these pretty documents about it and all these things. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But this, it's saying the same thing. Jude's saying, you're not going to get anywhere if you, the communication partner, don't have highly developed skills and are ready to be insightful and be a detective and figure it out. Simple, but it's got to be in the foundation of what we're doing, right? Okay. I did want to share, I know we're almost out of time. I did want to share, in Texas, we have a book study on this book that is free and anybody can join it. The book is free and the book study is free. We have 2 sessions a month. They're repeats. You just pick one. So we have one early morning and one afternoon session a month. So hopefully it can fit everybody's schedule. And you don't have to come to all of them. You just come when you are available. But there's a QR code in the middle of the screen right now. that will take you to registration for that book study. If that's something that you want to do, and like I said, you can pick and choose. You can come, don't come, whatever works for you. The schedule is also there, I believe, of which chapters we're going to be talking about when. They're very quick chapters. You can read most of these in like 10-15 minutes. And just come, and it's a very open discussion, and just chat about the students we serve, and without sharing confidential information, of course. And then just talk about how this applies to those students, and learn from each other and each other's experiences. We've done this book, I think this is the 3rd year, maybe, of this book study. And every single time I read this book, I get something new out of it. Every single time I have a conversation about these chapters, I learn something new about it. Everybody has different experiences to share, so would love for you to join that if you're available. Again, it's free. The book is free. Hopefully you've already downloaded it. I will put that back up in just a second. My email address is on this final slide. It's bennettk@tsbvi.edu. Somebody asked in the chat, they came in a little bit late, missed my introduction, and wondered who I am. I am a deafblind education consultant with a background in deaf education and deafblind education. And then somebody asked, how do deafblind classes work? I'm not sure what that's referring to. If you'll expand on that, I will answer that question in the chat if you want to clarify what you mean. And then Jen just dropped in the chat the post survey, so be sure that you do that. And then we have just a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions or wants to go back to any slides. I'm going to go back to, don't be sick from my slide. Okay. This is the free download one, free download QR that takes you to the Nordic Welfare Center website where you can download that publication. You can also send that link to your colleagues and friends. Oh, okay, so they clarified the question. So they were asking about deafblind classes, how students who are deafblind learn at school, if they have special schools or classes for that group of students. Great question. So it totally depends. A lot of times, I would say the majority of our students who are deafblind are in their local schools. They're in their home schools. They may be in self-contained special ed classrooms. They may be in general ed classrooms if you have proficient communicators who are deafblind. We also have, there's some regional schools depending on your state. There's regional schools for students who are deaf, and sometimes their students who are deafblind are in those regional programs. There's also state schools for the deaf and for the blind. And sometimes you'll find students who are deafblind at either the school for the deaf or the school for the blind or the school for the deaf and blind if you're a state that has them combined. And so you may see them there as well. So they're really in all placement options. I would say it's a pretty rare occasion that a classroom only has deafblind students in it. Most of the time you'll have classes where they're the only one who's deafblind, or maybe a couple kids who are deafblind. I have taught in a classroom that had 3 kids that was deafblind in there, and then we had maybe 5 or 6 kids who had other disabilities that were in that class. I know at the School for the Blind in Texas, there are some classrooms where all the kids are deafblind. But obviously Texas is a very large place with much larger population of deafblind students. So that is not as likely to happen in other places. But anybody who is teaching a student who's deafblind, whether you're in an itinerant setting or so traveling around school to school, or in a self-contained setting, whether it's at a general public school or at a school for the deaf or school for the blind, those individuals are able to, study deafblind education and learn how to use strategies for students who are deafblind. And each state has a each state has a deafblind project. And those deafblind projects are able to support anyone who needs support in educating a student who is deafblind. And that is birth to 22. So if you know of a student who is in a school program who your team or their team needs support in programming, you can reach out to your state deafblind project for support and technical assistance, and they're able to provide that to you. Jump to the last screen again. So my email address is back up. Bennett, BENNETTK at tsbvi.edu. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks so much for having me today. Jen, again, has that survey of participation for you in the chat. So make sure you complete that for her.
This is awesome. Thank you, Kaycee. I love thinking of all of the students that I've worked with. I can say, yep, that was that one. Yep, that was that one. Yep, that was that experience. Yep. I said one of my favorite stories always is there was a student who was deafblind, and in this regular classroom, they were talking about the atmosphere. And so they were hanging clouds. And the kids would hit their heads on the clouds all the time. So the first time this deafblind child went outside and with the group, the intervener said, "Oh, look, there's clouds." And the kid ducked because he thought for sure that he was going to hit his head. So it's also thinking about being very mindful, in some of those concepts that we teach, because what makes sense to a student who is sighted and hearing may not be quite the same for our student who's deafblind. So one of my favorite stories. Eventually, it took a long time to unwind that, right? But it was a very good learning experience for both the classroom teacher and for the intervener. And I think everybody working with that student, and those students are teaching us way more than we're teaching them. So thank you again for being here with us. Thank everyone for participating. Gina and Keith, thank you for interpreting for us this evening. We very much appreciate your expertise and skills. So we will be back here next month again with Kaycee talking about functional listening. This is where she's saying, okay, we have an audiogram, and we kind of have an idea of what an audiogram means and how they should be hearing. But what we're seeing on a piece of paper and what we're seeing in action look different. And what does that mean for our students? So everyone have a great evening. We hope to see you back here next month.
The WDBTAP logo is displayed and reads WESP DHH, Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project, WDBTAP. The logo and disclaimer for the ideas that work is displayed and reads. The contents of this presentation were developed under a grant from the U.S. Department of Education H326T230035. However, those contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the U.S. Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.